I smoothed the fabric of my black dress, my hands trembling slightly as I checked my reflection in the hotel lobby mirror. The place was upscale, discreet, the kind of hotel where no one asked questions. I had been here before enough times to know the front desk clerks wouldn't even glance up as I made my way to the elevator. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. A few stolen hours, a world away from reality, away from the life I had built with Daniel, my husband. The man I had promised forever to. I swallowed the lump in my throat and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the 12th floor. My lover was waiting. Room 1208. The hallways were dimly lit, lined with plush carpet that muffled my footsteps. My heart pounded harder with each step, anticipation and guilt twisting together inside me. I had told Daniel I was meeting a friend for dinner. He had kissed my cheek absent-mindedly before returning to his laptop, barely looking up. It had been too easy. When I reached the door, I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Then I slid the keycard through the lock. The green light blinked and I pushed the door open. But the man inside wasn't my lover, it was Daniel. He stood near the window, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The city lights behind him cast long shadows across the room, making his presence even more imposing. My breath caught in my throat as I froze in the doorway. "Close the door," he said, his voice calm. Too calm, my hand shook as I did what he asked, the latch clicking into place behind me. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. How had he known? How long had he known? Daniel tilted his head slightly, watching me like a predator sizing up its prey.
By the way, if you're curious about what happened next, subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Thank you.
Who were you expecting? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. There was no excuse, no lie that could explain this away. He had caught me, and there was no way out. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at Daniel, trying to decipher the expression on his face. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't demanding explanations. He was just watching me, his gaze cold and assessing, as if he were waiting for me to speak first. But what could I say? My excuses had dried up the moment I saw him standing there instead of the man I had come to meet. My throat felt tight as I forced myself to take a step forward, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. Daniel, his name felt foreign on my tongue in this room under these circumstances. His lips twitched slightly, but there was no humor in it. "You should sit down," he said, nodding toward the chair by the window. "We need to talk." Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to get out, to deny everything and pretend like this wasn't happening. But I knew better. There was nowhere to run. He had planned this. He had been waiting. I moved toward the chair, my legs shaky beneath me as I lowered myself into it. Daniel remained standing, his arms still crossed, his fingers tapping lightly against his bicep. How long? The question was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. I swallowed hard. "Daniel, please, don't just tell me how long," he interrupted, his voice eerily steady. I looked down at my hands, at the wedding ring still wrapped around my finger. It felt heavier than ever. "A few months," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He let out a short, humorless laugh and shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "A few months, and you really thought I wouldn't find out?" I lifted my gaze, desperation clawing at my chest. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," he shot back, his eyes dark and unreadable. "And the worst part, you didn't even hesitate. You walked in here expecting someone else, and if it had been him standing here instead of me, you wouldn't have thought twice." Tears burned at the edges of my vision, but I refused to let them fall. "I don't know what you want me to say." He took a slow step forward, lowering himself onto the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees. "I want to know why. I want to know what part of our life made you think this was okay." I sucked in a shaky breath. "It wasn't about you." His jaw tensed and he let out a slow, measured exhale. "That's the worst answer you could have given me." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the weight of his disappointment, his betrayal, but it was everywhere. It was in the air between us, in the sterile white walls of the hotel room, in the way he looked at me like he didn't recognize the woman sitting in front of him. "So what happens now?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse. He was quiet for a long moment before leaning back, his gaze never leaving mine. "That depends on you." His words settled into the air between us, heavy and unshakable. "That depends on you." My stomach twisted as I sat there, my hands gripping the fabric of my dress so tightly my knuckles turned white. What did he mean? Did he want me to confess everything, to fall to my knees and beg for forgiveness? Or was this some kind of test, a cruel way of making me squirm before he walked away for good? Daniel leaned back against the headboard, exhaling slowly. His fingers drummed against his thigh, an absent-minded movement that betrayed his inner turmoil. "Say something, Claire," he muttered, his voice quieter now, less commanding but no less dangerous. "Do you even feel guilty?" My chest tight. "Of course I do." "Then why?" His eyes locked onto mine, pinning me in place. Why was this worth risking everything? I wanted to tell him that it wasn't about worth, that it wasn't some calculated decision to destroy what we had. But that wasn't the answer he was looking for. He wanted something definitive, something that would make sense of the chaos I had created. But there was no simple explanation, no justification that would make this easier to swallow. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't thinking, I hesitated, searching for the right words, but nothing felt adequate. "It just happened," Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "It just happened." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression unreadable. "That's what you're going with?" I swallowed hard. "I know it sounds pathetic, and maybe it is, but I don't have a better answer. I was selfish and I made a mistake, a huge mistake." He let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. A mistake implies it was an accident, Claire, but you made a choice over and over again. I flinched at the truth in his words. He wasn't wrong. My betrayal hadn't been a fleeting moment of weakness. It had been a repeated decision. A series of stolen nights, lies woven so seamlessly into our life that I had convinced myself they weren't hurting anyone. Until now. Until this moment where I sat across from the man I had sworn to love and realized just how much damage I had done. Tense silence followed, the hum of the city outside barely audible through the thick hotel windows. Daniel watched me carefully, his gaze sharp but tired. "So what happens now?" I finally asked, my voice unsteady. He was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing absent patterns against the bedspread. "I don't know." His honesty sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I had expected anger, expected a firm decision, I'm leaving or I want a divorce. But this uncertainty, it was worse. Because it meant he was still weighing the cost of what I had done, still deciding whether I was worth salvaging. He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I need time." Panic flared in my chest. "Time for what?" Daniel turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "To figure out if I can even look at you the same way again." Then he grabbed his jacket, stepped toward the door, and without another word, he was gone. The door clicked shut and I sat frozen, listening to the echo of Daniel's footsteps fading down the hallway. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow as the full weight of what had just happened settled over me. He was gone, not storming out in a fit of rage, not making threats, but something worse. He had walked away without a fight. I buried my face in my hands, my fingers digging into my scalp. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to go. I had convinced myself that what I was doing wasn't hurting anyone, that my double life could exist in the shadows without consequences. But now, sitting in this hotel room that smelled of betrayal and cheap luxury, I realized just how foolish I had been. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually, I forced myself up from the chair, my legs unsteady as I moved toward the door. My hands trembled as I pulled it open, peering down the hallway, empty. I had no idea where Daniel had gone or if he was coming back. Part of me feared that this was it, that I had finally pushed him too far. I pulled my phone from my clutch, hesitating before dialing his number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. He was shutting me out. My stomach twisted as I leaned against the doorframe, my thoughts spiraling. What if he never came home? What if this was the beginning of the end? I forced myself to move, leaving the hotel behind and stepping into the night air. The city hummed around me, cars passing, laughter spilling from nearby bars, but it all felt distant, muffled. I hailed a cab, giving the driver my address before sinking into the back seat, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The house was dark when I arrived. I stepped inside, half expecting to find Daniel sitting in the living room waiting for me. But the silence was absolute. He wasn't here. I paced the kitchen, checking my phone every few minutes. Nothing. I sent a text, "Daniel, please come home, we need to talk." No response. The night stretched on, and with each passing hour, the fear grew heavier in my chest. What if he wasn't just avoiding me? What if he had already decided? At some point, exhaustion took over and I curled up on the couch, my body too tense to fully relax. I drifted in and out of restless sleep, jolting awake every time I heard the slightest noise. It wasn't until nearly dawn that the sound of the front door opening made my breath catch in my throat. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding as Daniel stepped inside. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but he didn't look at me. He just locked the door behind him and exhaled slowly. "Where were you?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. He ran a hand through his hair, finally meeting my gaze. "I don't know," he admitted, driving, thinking. I swallowed hard. "Are you leaving?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might say yes, but then he let out a tired breath and shook his head. "Not yet." His words, "not yet," hung between us, heavy and uncertain. Relief flickered in my chest, but it was brief. He wasn't saying he forgave me. He wasn't saying we could fix this. He was saying he hadn't made up his mind yet, and that terrified me more than if he had just walked away. Daniel moved past me without another word, heading toward the kitchen. I followed cautiously, unsure if I should speak or give him space. He reached for a glass, filled it with water, and leaned against the counter, his posture stiff. "Did you sleep?" I asked quietly. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Did you?" I swallowed, shaking my head. Of course, neither of us had. How could we? Silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that would prove to him that I wasn't the woman who had walked into that hotel room expecting someone else. But words felt useless now. "Are you going to tell me everything?" he finally asked, his voice level but laced with something sharp underneath. My stomach twisted. "I told you it didn't mean." "No," he interrupted, setting his glass down harder than necessary. "No more it didn't mean anything, or I wasn't thinking. I need to know, Claire, the details, the parts you don't want to say out loud." I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the fabric of my sweater. "Daniel, I don't want to hurt you more than I already have." His jaw clenched. "You should have thought about that months ago." He was right. He deserved the truth, even if it shattered whatever fragile thread was keeping us together. I took a slow, shaky breath. It started small, a message here and there. It felt harmless at first, and then one night it was. One night I crossed a line I never thought I would. Daniel's expression didn't change, but his knuckles turned white where they gripped the counter. And after that, I kept going back, I admitted, shame curling in my stomach. Not because I didn't love you, not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like someone saw me, like I wasn't invisible. His head tilted slightly, his eyes dark with something unreadable. And I didn't make you feel that way. Tears burned at the edges of my vision. It wasn't about you, Daniel. It was about me. I should have talked to you. I should have told you how lost I felt instead of. I trailed off, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. Instead of ruining us, he exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. And if I hadn't caught you, I flinched at the question, but I didn't look away. I don't know, maybe I would have stopped on my own, maybe I wouldn't have. And that's the worst part, isn't it? That I let it go on for so long. Daniel studied me for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Yeah, he said finally, his voice tired. That's the worst part. His words settled between us like a thin thread, fraying, fragile, but not yet broken. Not yet. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even a second chance. It was hesitation, the space between staying and leaving, between hope and inevitability. My stomach twisted as I watched him kick off his shoes, his movement slow, drained. Daniel didn't look at me as he stepped past, heading toward the kitchen. I followed, keeping my distance, afraid that if I pushed too hard, he'd finally snap. He opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and took a long drink before setting it down on the counter. Are you hungry? The words left my mouth before I could think, as if normalcy could somehow fix this. He let out a dry, humorless laugh, finally turning to face me. You think food is what I need right now? His voice wasn't angry, just tired. I lowered my gaze. I don't know what you need. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, me neither. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I wanted to reach for him to say something that would make this easier, but I didn't know how. He was right, this wasn't something that could be undone with words, with gestures, with apologies that came too late. Why did you come home? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel stared at me for a long moment before answering. Because I don't know if I want to leave yet. He picked up the water bottle again, rolling it between his hands. Because as much as I hate what you did, I don't know if I'm ready to walk away from everything we built. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was enough. Enough to tell me that despite everything, a part of him still saw us beneath the wreckage. I'll do whatever it takes, I said quietly. I mean that, Daniel. Whatever you need, time, space, honesty, I'll give it to you. Just don't shut me out. He studied me, his expression unreadable, then let out a slow breath. I'm not making any promises, not to you, not to myself, but I'm still here. It wasn't an assurance, it wasn't security, but it was something, and for now, something was enough. The weight of his words lingered between us. I'm still here, not a promise, not a declaration, just a fact, a temporary state of being that could shift at any moment. My chest tightened as I searched his face for something, anger, grief, maybe even the smallest flicker of hope, but he was unreadable. Daniel took another sip of water, then set the bottle down and rubbed his temples. I need sleep. His voice was hoarse, drained, and I suddenly realized just how exhausted he looked. The shadows under his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged as if the burden of the last few hours had physically worn him down. Take the bed, I said quickly. I'll sleep in the guest room. His gaze flicked to mine, something unreadable passing through it. You don't have to do that, I swallowed. I do. He hesitated for a moment but didn't argue. Instead, he nodded and turned toward the stairs. I stayed in the kitchen, listening to the sound of his footsteps retreating, my hands gripping the counter as I tried to steady myself. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier. Like something had shifted in the foundation of what we used to be, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be rebuilt. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face in that hotel room, the way his expression barely flickered when he saw me standing there, caught in the act. I had hurt him in a way I couldn't take back, and no matter how much I wanted to fix this, I didn't know if I had the right to ask for that chance. Morning came too soon. When I finally forced myself out of bed, Daniel was already downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up when I entered but didn't say anything. I hesitated before moving to the coffee maker, pouring myself a cup, my hands trembling slightly as I sat across from him. I meant what I said last night, I murmured. I'll do whatever it takes, Daniel, but I need to know if you want me to try. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. I don't know what I want yet, Claire. He stared at his coffee, his fingers tapping against the mug. But I know I'm not ready to walk away, not yet. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. Then I'll wait as long as you need. Daniel looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something shift in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even acceptance, but it was something, a flicker of possibility, and right now, that was enough. Days passed in a strange limbo. We existed in the same space, but the distance between us was undeniable. Daniel spoke when necessary, short sentences that barely scratched the surface of real conversation. I didn't push. I knew he was still processing everything, still deciding if he could even look at me without seeing the betrayal. I kept my promises, I gave him space, I didn't try to force words out of him, I let him dictate the pace. But it was excruciating. Every time he walked past me without looking, every time his phone buzzed and he turned away to answer it, every time I caught him staring at me like he was trying to figure out if I was even the same person he married, it cut deeper. On the fifth night, I found him outside on the back porch, a beer in his hand, the glow of the patio light casting long shadows across the wooden deck. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I was welcome in this moment. But then he spoke, his voice low. You can sit. I stepped outside carefully, lowering myself onto the chair next to him. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant car exhaust. He took a slow sip of his drink before finally looking at me. I've been thinking about it, he said, his tone even controlled. What it would take to move forward. My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay still. And Daniel set his beer down on the small table beside him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I need to know it's over completely. No lingering texts, no unresolved feelings, no what-ifs. I swallowed hard. It's over, it's been over. He nodded, but his gaze remained sharp. Then I want to hear you say it. I want you to call him right now. End it while I'm sitting here. The request sent a cold shock through my system, not because I had anything to hide, but because it made everything so final. There would be no rewriting the past, no pretending I could compartmentalize what happened. This was the line between who I had been and who I had to become if I wanted to keep my marriage. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through my contacts until I found his name. The name that had once made my heart race with anticipation now felt like poison in my hands. I hit call, pressing the speaker button so Daniel could hear every word. He picked up after 2 rings. Claire, his voice was soft, expectant. I forced my spine to straighten. This is the last time we'll speak, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. Whatever this was, it's done, don't call me again. A pause, then a sigh. You sure about that? I glanced at Daniel, whose expression remained unreadable, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. Yes, I said firmly, I'm sure. Another beat of silence, then the line went dead. I let out a slow breath, setting my phone down as the weight of the moment settled over me. Daniel didn't speak right away. He just nodded, picked up his beer, and took another sip. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he said, "That's a start." Words hung between us, thick with unspoken meaning. That's a start. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself as Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring into the darkness beyond our backyard. His expression remained unreadable, his posture rigid despite his calm tone. I wanted to ask him what came next, but I was afraid of the answer, afraid that even after everything, he still didn't know. Or worse, that he did. That he had already made his decision and was only waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. Instead, I stayed quiet, letting the night settle around us. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional chirp of crickets, it was all so painfully normal. If someone had looked in from the outside, they would have seen a married couple sharing a quiet moment on their porch. They wouldn't have seen the fractures beneath the surface, the way every glance, every breath felt like a test we were both failing. Daniel finally broke the silence. I don't know if I'll ever trust you again. His voice was steady, almost too controlled, as if he had been holding those words in for days, weeks. My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to nod. I know. He turned his head slightly, finally looking at me. Do you? I swallowed. Yes, and I don't expect you to, not now, maybe not ever. His jaw tight. Then why are you still here? The question caught me off guard. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I hadn't expected him to ask it so plainly. Because I love you, I said softly. Because I made the biggest mistake of my life, and I know that, and if there's even the smallest chance that you could ever look at me the way you used to, I have to try. Even if it takes years, even if it never happens at all. Daniel let out a slow breath, running a hand down his face. I don't know if I can do years, Claire. His honesty stung, but I appreciated it. Then let's not think about years, let's think about today and tomorrow, and we'll figure out the rest when we get there. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his beer, taking another sip before setting it down with a quiet thud. Then after what felt like an eternity, he said, all right, we'll try, but on my terms. I nodded quickly. Whatever you need. His eyes darkened slightly, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then here's my first condition. No more lies, no more half-truths. If I ask you something, I expect the full answer no matter how much it hurts. I didn't hesitate. Okay. He studied me as if testing whether I truly meant it. Then he nodded, leaning back in his chair again. All right, the conversation wasn't over. The pain wasn't gone. But for the first time since that night in the hotel room, there was something else in the air between us. A sliver of possibility. And for now, that was enough. The next few days were quiet, but not in the suffocating way they had been before. Something had shifted between us, not a resolution, not even a real sense of progress, but an acknowledgement that we were both still here. That neither of us had walked away yet. Daniel remained distant, careful with his words and his actions, but there were moments fleeting, barely noticeable, where I caught glimpses of something softer. The way his gaze lingered a second too long when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his fingers tightened around his coffee mug in the morning when I sat across from him. The way he hesitated before leaving for work, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. I didn't push. I knew better now. He needed to come to me on his own terms, and I would wait however long it took. On the 4th night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard him behind me. Claire. His voice was quiet but firm. I turned off the water, drying my hands before facing him. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I have another condition. My stomach tight, but I nodded. Okay. He exhaled slowly, as if measuring his words before speaking. I want to know everything, every detail, every moment. No more hiding, no more protecting me from the truth. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Daniel, you agreed, no more lies, no more half-truths. His gaze was steady, unwavering. If we're doing this, I need to know exactly what I'm forgiving, or if I even can. I swallowed hard. Okay. He pulled out a chair and sat down, nodding for me to do the same. My heart pounded as I lowered myself into the seat across from him, my hands resting on the table between us. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Tell me how it started, why it started." I forced myself to meet his gaze, even though it hurt, even though I knew the next words out of my mouth could change everything. "It started because I was lonely," I admitted, "because I felt invisible, and I didn't know how to tell you that without feeling like I was failing as a wife." His jaw clenched, but he nodded. "Go on." So I did. I told him everything. Every moment, every meeting, every lie I had told him to cover my tracks. I laid it all bare, the ugly, unfiltered truth. And the whole time he just sat there listening, his expression unreadable. When I finished, silence filled the space between us. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the battle between anger and something else, something even heavier. "Okay," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I need time to process this." I nodded, my throat tight. "Take all the time you need." Daniel stood, staring down at me for a long moment. Then without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my confession. The next morning, the house felt different. Not empty, not cold, but heavy, like the weight of last night's conversation still lingered in the walls and the air between us. Daniel had barely spoken after I told him everything. He hadn't slammed doors or yelled or even looked at me with the disgust I had been bracing for. Instead, he had just left the room, and that silence, that absence of anger, was somehow worse. I found him in the kitchen, staring into his coffee like it held the answers he was searching for. He didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge me as I poured my own cup, and hesitated before sitting across from him. The quiet stretched between us, thick and unbearable, until finally he spoke. "I don't know what to do with all of this." His voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. "I asked for the truth, you gave it to me. And now I don't know if I'm better or worse for knowing." I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around my mug. "I'm sorry, Daniel, I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I know you're sorry, Claire, but sorry doesn't change what happened. Sorry doesn't erase those nights, those lies." He finally lifted his gaze, and the exhaustion in his eyes made my stomach twist. "I don't know if I can live with this." Panic flared in my chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't know if I can stay married to you." The words landed like a punch, knocking the air from my lungs. I had known this was a possibility, of course I had, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Daniel, please," he held up a hand, cutting me off. "I'm not making any decisions right now. I need space, more than just avoiding each other in the same house. I need to be somewhere that isn't here." My throat tight. "You're leaving?" For a while, his jaw clenched. "I need to clear my head, figure out what I actually want, what I can live with." I nodded slowly, even though every part of me wanted to beg him to stay. I had no right to ask that of him. I had already taken too much. "Okay, when?" He set his mug down, standing up from the table. "Today," I sucked in a shaky breath. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet." He turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable. "I just know I can't be here." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Do you think you'll come back?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then finally said, "I don't know." And then, just like that, he was gone.
Thank you for watching the video. If you want to hear more stories, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Videos are released every day. Good luck to everyone.